Queen Elizabeth I said in her dying moments, "All my possessions for a moment of time," while Italian artist Raphael's last word was simply happy. Some people claim that when Harriet Tubman was dying in 1913, her last words were "Swing low, sweet chariot," as she sang with family and friends. But her actual last words were, "Give my love to the churches, tell the women to stand firm. I go to prepare a place for you." Some people at the moment of their death are able to coherently utter final words. And for those who are able to do that, these words can hold incredible value and importance. They may provide insight into the person, the values, feelings, deepest beliefs, and perspectives that they have held dear. These final words might express the most meaningful reflections on life or even the most painful regrets. We are privileged to have the final words that Jesus uttered on the cross, and it is a worthy endeavor to take a few moments to examine and understand his final words. What insight might they give us into his identity, his relationship to the Father, or his purpose? What wisdom might they impart to us in our own lives and even in our own moments of suffering and death? Not only are his final words important, but they occur in the middle of important events that give context and meaning to his words, his death, his mission, and meaning to our lives and faith. Luke 26, verses 44 to 46 record the final moments of Jesus' life. "It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, for the sun stopped shining. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out with a loud voice, 'Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.' When he had said this, he breathed his last. The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, 'Surely this was a righteous man.' When all the people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. But all those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things." Jesus had been on the cross for several hours now, and the end was near. At this point, Luke records two significant events: darkness that covered the land in the middle of the day, and the temple curtain spontaneously and on its own tearing into two. Right after these two events, Jesus cries out and utters his last words. Luke orders these events a bit differently than the other gospel writers. Luke puts the darkness and the tearing of the temple curtain before the moment of Jesus' death, where both Matthew and Mark record the darkness, two cries from Jesus, his death, and then the curtain tears in two. The placement of the darkness and the curtain tearing together in Luke implies that the two events can be interpreted together, that they contribute to the same meaning of what is happening. Let's look at each event separately and then together. For some scholars, the darkness that covers the whole land harkens back to the Day of the Lord motif from prophetic literature. Amos, Joel, and Zephaniah all speak of the judgment that accompanies the day of the Lord. Zephaniah says that it will be a day of wrath, a day of distress and anguish, a day of trouble and ruin, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness. Luke describes the event as the sun stopped shining. This darkening of the sun is an apocalyptic sign that signals that the wicked will be judged, but the righteous will be saved. The very creation, the darkening of the sun, is speaking out about the judgment and vindication happening in the death of Christ. The ultimate day of the Lord is not fulfilled here on the cross, but is still to come. But the darkness continues the pattern and describes what will be accomplished in moments through the death of Christ. Other scholars look at the darkness not as judgment in alignment with the prophetic day of the Lord, but as a contrast with Jesus as the light of the world. Luke's audience is a Gentile audience, and his audience would not have understood the connection to the day of the Lord and to the eschatological signs. They would, however, have understood that darkness was a sign of the death of a great person. Was the darkness supernatural or a natural occurrence? There are a variety of theories as to what was happening when all the gospel writers describe a darkness that covered the land. Some think that it was an eclipse or a particular wind that occurs in the Mediterranean that was strong enough to block out the sun. Regardless of whether the darkness was supernatural or, as Alfred Plummer terms it, a providential coincidence, it is a deeply significant event that cries out that this is a moment of importance. And when Luke combines this darkness with the temple curtain, we can't miss the powerful activity of God in this moment. The word used here in Luke for the temple curtain is ambiguous, and it's not clear whether he is referring to the curtain that separated the Holy of Holies or the veil between the temple and the outer courts. The inner curtain, tearing in two, would be profoundly meaningful, as the Holy of Holies could only be entered by the high priest and only once a year. But the inner curtain would not have been public, and Luke seems to imply this is one of the events that powerfully impacts the centurion, the crowds, and the women who followed Jesus in the following verses. So it would need to be public. If Luke meant the outer curtain, it would have been public. The people would have known about the tear just as they experienced the darkness. So we have darkness on the land and the temple curtain tearing in two together, which leads us to interpret them together in the lead up to the moment of Jesus' final words and death. We can look on the darkness and the curtain as the evil being perpetrated upon Jesus, the condemnation on the temple itself, the end of the temple as the centerpiece of God's activity, or the foreshadowing of the destruction of the temple. We can also look upon these two events in a salvific way, the vindication and salvation that is inherent in the day of the Lord pattern, alongside the new access to God through Christ's death, the tearing in two of the barrier between humanity and God that Christ destroys, opening up a pathway for restoration. Imagine being in the crowd watching this man who has been condemned to death, hanging under a sign proclaiming him as the King of the Jews, the Messiah. Imagine watching his life ebb away, and then suddenly the sun stops shining. Darkness covers the whole land, and you hear word rumbling through the crowd that the temple curtain has just torn in two. Something is happening. There's a realization that something profound and momentous is occurring. And then at this moment, the man on the cross utters a loud cry. Both Matthew and Mark reference a loud cry at this point in the narrative, but only Luke gives specifics about what is said in this cry. Dennis Silva says that in Luke, Jesus' cry is an articulate prayer, not an inarticulate cry. The words on Jesus' lips in this loud cry at the very end come directly from Psalm 31:5. And he addresses this prayer to his Father, the familial term that Jesus uses to refer to God. It is an intimate prayer at the moment of death. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. The psalmist in Psalm 31 is crying out in faith. It is the cry of a righteous one who is suffering. Throughout the psalmist speaks about his distress, his sorrow, and his physical pain, his affliction and anguish of soul. He cries out about the contempt of his enemies and his abandonment. Yet the psalmist turns to God and declares his trust in the Lord. He recounts the Lord's goodness and the wonders of his love. He proclaims in verse 15 that my times are in your hands. In the middle of the cries of anguish and the declarations of trust, the psalmist commits his spirit into the hands of the Lord, his faithful God. This is the psalm from which Jesus draws his final words. This is the text he chooses as he faces his death. It is the cry of trust and faith. It is a declaration that God will care for him and redeem him. Verse 23 of the psalm says, "The Lord preserves those who are true to him." Christ is the ultimate fulfillment of this psalm. He is the righteous one, suffering an unjust death. He's experiencing the pain, anguish, and sorrow of taking all the sins of the world on his shoulders. Yet amid this suffering, Jesus trusts that God will deliver and accomplish his will. There will be vindication and salvation. This articulate prayer of trust and faith is uttered in the moment of greatest pain and sorrow. This is otherworldly. The capacity to trust that God the Father will deliver and accomplish his goodness when all appears lost is supernatural. It is the work of God. And when this public cry of trust is combined with the darkness and the temple curtain tearing in two, the impact of those watching the crucifixion is profound. The centurion proclaims Jesus' innocence. The crowds are overwhelmed with mourning, beating their breasts. They have just witnessed God's presence and activity in their midst. The power of Jesus' final words in the context of God's miraculous activity in the darkness and the temple curtain is that we have access to the Father and the working of the Spirit. God is active in the world around us, and taking the time to truly see the hand of God in our lives and the lives of others around us propels us to this place of trust and faith, even in the middle of pain and sorrow and abandonment. Life is challenging. It is not linear, nor is it easily understood. It can be relentlessly difficult. There is suffering, and evil seems to flourish at times. The challenge for us is to be so in tune with the activity of God around us that even in the complexity and anguish of life, we can say in trust, Father, into your hands I commit my life. Into your hands I commit my plans, my pain, my joys. Into your hands I commit my disappointment, my fear, and my anxiety. When we experientially know that God is active and present with us, we can declare the same kind of trust that the Father will rescue, redeem, and deliver. And the power of our testimony, this otherworldly trust amidst darkness, will impact those around us.